Tongcha tongki minamni kanki yultu pampa we dani chibu pamchepa teni yulle jave chok.
Although one may conquer in battle 1,000 men, yet the greatest victor is the one who conquers himself.
This idea of ego is very misunderstood. We don't need to not have a sense of self or identity. Of course we do. I'm Eve Ekman. I'm a daughter. I'm a contemplative social scientist. I'm a friend, right? I'm all these different aspects of who I am, and I can't just all of a sudden have amnesia and have no memory, recollection, no sense of who that is and those ties and those relationships, which are so important.
Buddhist and other Tibetan literatures describe how the monstrous enemy of the ego and the addicted ego attachment harms us all the time, cuts us off from relationships, makes us suffer, but also makes us do things that we regret afterwards, makes us hurt others. And when others hurt us, it's because they're under the control of that monstrous psychological state.
There's no way to not have identity. It is always comes down to how open identity is, how flexible identity is.
Welcome to Season 4 of AWAKEN, a podcast from the Rubin Museum of Himalayan Art about the dynamic path to enlightenment and what it means to wake up. I'm Isabella Rossellini, an actress, a filmmaker, and your host for this season of AWAKEN, where we are exploring a fundamental concept in Buddhist thinking and philosophy, attachment. Himalayan art has long been a pathway to insights and awakening. And in this season, we will look at objects from the Rubin's collection as a way to better understand attachment and its counterpoint, non-attachment, which translate into openness or seeing things as they truly are. With stories and wisdom from artists, writers, poets, Buddhist teachers, psychologists, scholars, and others, we will explore the meaning of attachment and how it shows up in different parts of our lives. In this episode, ego. So many of the challenges that arise with attachment are related to our ego. Who we think we are, how we think others should feel about us, think about us, treat us. And really how we see ourselves as separate from others, holding on so tightly to ourselves that we miss out on the fundamental truth of what Buddhist Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh called our interbeing. We're all connected, and yet our attachment to our ego and the identity we've constructed from it often keeps us separated. Contemplative social scientist Eve Ekman.
I'd say it's kind of this compulsive way we think about ourselves. And it's not that, again, we are great. We deserve a lot of love and attention and care. But when we are so centralized, it actually is the root of suffering. So it's not do this dissolution of your ego or somehow loosen the ties of your ego because that's the right thing to do. It's look really closely and really notice, where is your suffering coming from? And it's these ideas and identities. I myself have been really working with for years now, this sense of deficiency, not enough. And I know this is common from all my students and being able to offer for them what I've learned and hear their reflections. This identification with someone who isn't good enough. My God, such suffering.
If you ask a person, what is happening in your mind? What they typically report is that they're thinking about themselves.
Psychologist Dr. Richie Davidson, founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and founder and chief visionary for Healthy Minds Innovations, Inc.
It may be that they're going through their to-do list. I need to do this, I need to do that, or reflecting on some activity in the past that they did, but it's very self-referential.
I love the part of identification with someone who's great, right? When I do something I feel proud of, when I'm recognized, but it's temporary. And so if I'm like living my whole life there, it's this what's called a hungry ghost phenomena. There's never enough. I have one feeling of success, achievement, or being loved, and it's almost like a bucket with a hole in it. I just need to keep filling it up and keep filling it up. So it's so wonderful to be reflected beautifully in the world. It's so important to be self-reflective and think of what do I need to do and change, but to also have this sense of basic goodness, basic okayness. There is something in me that's already okay. I don't actually need to earn being good.
If your identity is very dynamic, that means appearances will not affect you, because it will always turn out to be supportive. And there are people, no matter what happens in their life, they grow. Yeah, they advance their sense of self and growth.
Teacher and meditation master in the Bon Buddhist tradition, Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche.
Other identities, no matter what happens in their life, they always go downward. So it's like that identity has being dynamic or not. Dynamic basically means you're open enough and aware enough. These two things, open enough, aware enough, will make more dynamic or less dynamic. So that means that whatever they're facing, they're looking from the perspective of open possibility, infinite possibility. So they're not threatened. Their sense of self is not threatened. They take it, everything is like world is there to help them, support them, guide them.
Of course the past matters. Of course the past influences how we see the world, how we act in the world.
Again, Eve Ekman.
And we have this opportunity to see, again, fancy word, but the emptiness of those past sense of self. And emptiness not as in vacant or void, but as in ever-changing. Who I am this morning is a bit different than who I was yesterday morning. I had all these different experiences yesterday that, opened me or changed me or moved me. And if I'm not too busy to notice them, I'll really see that constant subtle change of my consciousness, who I am in the world, how I relate to the world, how I feel about myself. And that fluidity, it's so natural, to have that more fluid sense of who we are.
To get to that open state, the one that is free from attachment to the ego, it's almost as if the ego has to be trampled, destroyed. And that's exactly what we see in a 16th or 17th century clay sculpture from the Rubin Museum of Himalayan Art, depicting the wrathful deity Panjanatha Mahakala. Take a moment to look at the work at rubinmuseum.org/awaken. Scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, Annabella Pitkin explains.
In this image, this golden image, we see the wrathful aspect of Mahakala standing full frontal facing the viewer, holding in his hands a skull cup with what looks to me like the kind of flames of awareness, and standing on the body of a human figure. So the body that Mahakala is standing on represents the ego of the viewer and the ferocious cutting or trampling of that ego. And then the base of this is a lotus, right? There's always a lotus supporting Buddhas in this artistic style. And then all around, there's a halo, and it's a kind of fierce halo that matches the wrathful aspect of Mahakala. There's a kind of tendril of flaming clouds around this halo. And so It's a very compact image. It's gilded, it's beautiful, and it has a kind of satisfying, rounded shape because of the halo and because of the way that the shape of the Mahakala body fits perfectly within the oval of the halo. And then there's a kind of gloss on the human figure that symbolizes the ego. So there's a kind of juxtaposition of the wrathfulness of Mahakala with the satisfying aesthetic quality of how perfectly contained in the architectural form of the piece the whole image is. The freedom from attachment and from the violence and greed that can come from this kind of self-grasping fundamentally come from a misunderstanding of the self. And when Mahakala tramples the ego here, he's trampling both the ignorant miscognition of how I am in the world and all the violence and greed and addiction that flow from that, not to punish or to harm, but to set free, to say there never really was any problem. Where would you have been that you wouldn't have been connected with everything else?
In 2020, my life blew up is the best way I can describe it. Like, everything fell apart in a very short period of time. Everything I thought made sense and grounded me and affirmed my sense of me just was gone over the course of a week.
Author and transformational thought leader, Sonya Renee Taylor.
And so I want to say that was like the beginning of the separating of the construction and, the construction, which I call ego, and my soul self, perhaps is the way I'll talk about that. It was clear that there was a death, an ego death, this version of you is gone, pumpkin, and there's nothing you get to do about it. I had been, since 2018, working on a memoir project that was about myself and my mother and our story and this sort of unfolding of our lives together and, what I felt I had learned from that. And I had been getting inclinations that maybe I wasn't going to be able to write this book, that I was very, very committed to. And all I know is that I got a very clear message that I was not to write this book. Very clear. And the utter rage and anger and despair and just such an intense feeling of me versus whatever this force is that's taking away this thing from me. And I was so angry. I mean, I remember I was at an Airbnb in North Carolina, and I was just yelling, like, you take everything. I can't even have my own story. And I was enraged. I was enraged.
One of the things that viewers of Himalayan and Tibetan Buddhist art that portrays a enlightened being or a deity in a wrathful form, one of the first responses that people often have, if it's the first time they've seen something like that, is a kind of fear, right? The wrathful quality of the deity, the wrathful quality of the Buddha's wide open eyes, or their teeth, or the protruding tongue, the kind of, almost like a snarl or a roar, and the flames and the kind of intensity of the gaze, not to mention the fact that the shape of a human is being trampled here. That can really intimidate a viewer. It can be scary.
I also had been, in this process long enough to know that there wasn't anything to do but surrender. I by this point, I was like, you can try to hold on if you want to. That does not turn out well for you. So I guess it's goodbye story. And for the next 10 days, I just sat in this house, laying on the couch, trying to figure out why life, why be alive, right? I can't have anything that's mine. not even my story. There is no my. And there was Sonya, the ego, in this experience, narrating it that way. And then there was this observer self, this energy that is source knowing, that understood that my ego self was having some feelings about this experience, but that it was not those feelings, and it was not that experience, and it was not that story, and that there was, this construction of my beingness made by the world and made by my experiences. And then there was this other thing that was watching it all happen and knew that all the questions I was asking and all the stories I was telling about it and all the anger I was having was just an expression of this construction trying to hold on to itself.
People often ask me, students often ask me whether the Buddha or the deity is angry or whether they're dangerous. And a really important aspect of understanding the language of wrathful iconography is to have some sense of that wrath as a kind of pure expression of compassion and wisdom, that this wrathful quality is directed not at vulnerable humans who long to be cherished, but actually at the sources of personal suffering, at the fierce enemies that are the kind of real bad guys, we could say. And so in Buddhist terms, in Tibetan and Himalayan Buddhist ways of talking about it, we could say, what are the real enemies? What are the real bad guys, the real kind of scary monsters? Well, they are attachment, which we could talk about as addiction or craving, addictive thirst, grasping attachment. And that terrifying psychological state has two companions. The other two are the state of anger or rage or the impulse to violence, hatred, another monster. And then the kind of root monster of them all is the monstrous, ferocious problem of ignorance, the kind of misperception of how things exist.
This observer energy kept informing me that there was nothing to do except just sit in it. And at the end of those 10 days, I was so clear that some part of me that was highly identified with everything that had ever happened to me and everything I'd ever created and all of that some version of that had died and was very much gone. And whatever was left had a lot less investment in those constructions and those narratives and those things that had been made.
We really have to understand the close, almost inextricable relationship between ignorance and attachment to really get what Mahakala is doing in this moment. The miscognition of ourselves and reality, the experience that we have, that everybody has, that maybe even animals have, of being separate from everything else, so that if you want something, you might have to punch somebody to get it. You might have to grab it. You might have to hug it to yourself and not share it, right? All of those impulses toward grasping, attachment, violence, envy, jealousy, hatred, cruelty, that fundamentally is all powered by this sense of being alone in the universe and separate. And that, according to Buddhists, is a complete misunderstanding. It is a false cognition. In fact, we never are alone, and we never were.
I was talking about the phrase alone in nature, and that this is an impossible thing for me, not only because, there's the co-presence of me and these other animals, but these other beings are also here.
Jenny Odell, avid birdwatcher, artist, and author of How to Do Nothing, a New York Times bestseller, consider how and when we let go of our ego, that focus on the self, and we begin to really recognize and see those around us.
I was at the Rose Garden, and I write a lot about crows and how to do nothing and getting to know my neighborhood crows and how they recognize human faces and all this. So I was in the Rose Garden, and I was talking to one of the gardeners who I've known for many years at this point, because I go there so much. And this crow just walked up to us, and it walked up to us exactly like how a person would walk up. If you were at the Rose Garden and you overheard your friends talking in the distance and you walked up, that's exactly how this crow, and it walked right up. Like, it just looked like it was like part of the conversation. And the gardener introduced me to the crow and said, "Oh, this is Peanut." And I was like, "Oh, nice to meet you." And then he gave the crow a peanut, of course. He was like, "Sometimes he just follows me around the garden, I was thinking about that later, and the Rose Garden had been like pretty empty that day because it was pretty hot. And I, in my mind, when we had started having that conversation, we were alone, where it was just us talking. There's literally other animals listening. And in this case, this one recognizes his voice and walks over.
We always are and always have been and always will be completely interconnected and interdependent with everything and everyone else. And once that wisdom insight has dawned, then attachment and rage and violence look very different.
Me, these words don't mean the same thing today that they used to mean. And there is a different expression of my energy today that doesn't feel less vibrant, just when we're at ease with life.
Whatever their sense of identity they have, their identity is much more open.
This ease with life comes when we become less attached to ourselves. And it's not about losing oneself. It's about flexibility and openness.
And they are very aware and connected to their sense of self. There is some sense of confidence. There is some sense of stability. There's some sense of groundedness. There's some sense of they are happy. There's some sense of they're excited of their sense of self. They have some sense of optimistic of their sense of self.
In my experience, a part of our assignment as humans is to come back and realize there's no separation, right? To recognize that there is no distinction between us, right? And there is no you and them, or me and them, or the other, that it is all life in its multiplicities of expressions.
There is a beautiful poem by the 13th century poet Rumi called Out Beyond Ideas. It speaks directly to what can happen when we let go of our ego. Part of it goes, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, languages, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. May we lay in the field and remember we're not alone. You just heard the voices of Dr. Richie Davidson, Eve Ekman, Jenny Odell, Annabella Pitkin, Sonya Renee Taylor, and Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche. I'm Isabella Rossellini, your host. To see the artwork discussed in this episode, go to rubinmuseum.org/awaken. If you are enjoying the podcast, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts and tell your friends. For more stories and news from the Rubin, follow us on Instagram at Rubin Museum, and sign up for our newsletter at rubinmuseum.org. AWAKEN Season 4 is an 8-part series from the Rubin. AWAKEN is produced by the Rubin Museum of Himalayan Art with Tenzin Wangyal, Jamie Lawyer, Kimon Keramidas, Gracie Marotta, Christina Watson, and Sarah Zabrodsky, in collaboration with Sound Made Public, including Tanya Ketenjan, Philip Wood, Alessandro Santoro, and Jeremiah Moore. Original music has been produced by Hannis Brown, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. AWAKEN Season 4 and Reimagine Himalayan Art Now are supported by Bob and Louis Bayless, Barbara Bowman, Daphne Hogg Cunningham and John Cunningham, Noah P. Dorsky, Marina Abramovich Institute, Mimi Gardner Gates, Fred Eichener, Jacques and Natasha Gilman Foundation, Jack Lampel, Dan Gimbel of NEPC LLC, Agnes Gant, New York Life, Matt and Ann Minetz, Namita and Arun Saraf, the Prospect Hill Foundation, Eileen Caulfield Schwab, Taipei Cultural Center in New York, and Uovo. This program is supported in part by public fund from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. The Rubin Museum's programs are made possible by the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of Governor Kathy Hochul and the New York State Legislature. Reimagine Himalayan Art Now is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts. Thanks for listening.